March 1951, North Korea. The forces of South Korea, supported by men of the United Nations Command Force, are trying to hold their ground against a massive counterattack by the Chinese People's Volunteer Army and its North Korean allies. The Korean War is well into a second year of bloody conflict, a war that has already exacted a high price. The Korean War had begun 8 months earlier, on June 23, 1950. An initial attack by the NKPA, the Army of the North, and its communist leader, Kim Il-sung, had fallen just short of overwhelming the forces of the South and its pro-American leader, Syngman Rhee. The vital intervention of a force under the auspices of the United Nations Command, led by the United States, had halted the North Korean advance. When, in early November 1950, the UNC force pushed the Northern Army back over the 38th parallel into North Korea and threatened the Chinese border at the Yalu River, China's leader, Mao Zedong, secured the support of his ally, the Soviet Union, and decided to commit his army to the defense of the North. A long, hard winter of vicious fighting ensued. While the people of Korea struggled to survive amidst the fighting and the hand-to-hand encounters, tank battles, and artillery exchanges of a soldier's war, the politicians engaged in their own deadly skirmish. The threatened perils of the Cold War between East and West became much more likely when American and Chinese troops began to kill one another on the battlefield. US President Harry Truman sanctioned the use of atomic weapons if necessary, and they were moved to the Japanese island of Okinawa in readiness. Only 5 years after the end of the horror of the Second World War, the world braced itself for a third global conflagration. Using original colour film, fully restored in high definition, much of it never seen before. This is the story of Korea, the Forgotten War, in colour. April 22nd, 1951, just north of the 38th parallel, the line that divides the two Koreas. A United Nations command force that includes US Marines and infantry, British and Commonwealth troops, men from the Turkish Army Command Force and the Army of the South, the ROK, are facing yet another onslaught as the fifth phase offensive of the Chinese Volunteer Army and the North's NKPA begins. Fought out amidst the mountains and valleys of Korea's hinterland, it's one of the most vicious periods of the war. Yi Tok-chin, a school teacher in the south, the Ridge of Blood.
I am looking at a scene of slaughter now. Earth and sky alike swoon at the deafening roar of cannon. But the dove-white 1-11 height is resplendent in the rising sun. How cavalier is the moment that separates the living from the dead. Flesh bursts and blood spurts, and streams of crimson dye the surrounding valleys red. The landscape changes as corpses pile up, and the witch becomes a bloodthirsty devil.
By late May 1951, the opposing forces have fought to a standstill, and the long, drawn-out agony of a military stalemate begins to loom. Although the intensity of the fighting subsides, it continues in smaller skirmishes, and the number of casualties rises relentlessly. The Soviet representative at the United Nations, Jacob Malik, initiates ceasefire negotiations on June 23rd, and on July the 10th, they begin at Kaesong. A captured document from communist forces describes the conditions being endured by their troops on the ground and helps explain their willingness to negotiate.
A shortage of transportation and escort personnel makes it impossible to accomplish the mission of supplying the troops. As a result, our soldiers frequently starve. From now on, the organization of our rear service units should be improved. The troops are hungry. They eat cold food. Some only had 2 potatoes in 2 days. They have no strength for combat. Wounded men cannot be evacuated. The firepower of our entire army is inadequate. When we need our artillery, we have no shells. When we do have shells, many of them are dots.
Sadly, the ceasefire talks in Kaesong do not produce an early breakthrough, or even the prospect of one. The chasm between the two sides is too wide to close. The posturing, disputes and diplomacy will go on for another 2 years. All the while, the fighting continues. The casualty figures for the armed forces of both sides rise inexorably, while the civilian population, north and south, caught in the midst of battles, air raids, and indiscriminate acts of brutality, pays an even higher price. It will be a long and agonizing 2 years. July 1951, Yanggu, South Korea. In the same week as ceasefire negotiations begin at Kaesong, US-led UNC forces are supplied with the latest morale-boosting firepower. the finest in Hollywood showbiz. Jack Benny and his entertainment troupe provide the music, while screen idol Errol Flynn does the star turn. Later in the year, Danny Kaye and Monica Lewis top the bill. Throughout the summer and early autumn of 1951, what had been a war of rapid advance and retreat for both sides during the previous year becomes an attritional stalemate. The communist delegation suspends the ceasefire negotiations on August 23rd, claiming UNC troop encroachments close to the site of the talks at Kaesong. Many of the battle sites are given emotive names by UNC soldiers: Heartbreak Ridge, Punch Bowl, Bloody Ridge, as the fighting more and more resembles the trench warfare of the First World War. Eight divisions of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army dig into well-fortified covered trenches with bunkers and entrenched heavy artillery positions. General Pak Sun-yop, commander of the South's ROK 1st Division.
The UN command recaptured the crucial Punch Bowl area from the enemy, but paid a heavy price in blood. The fighting proved costly, because the truce talks had provided communist forces time to reorganize their units and harden their positions. The UNC paid an horrendous price as a result.
The Chinese and North Korean armies are exhausted after the brutal warfare of the previous months, and in late October, China initiates new ceasefire negotiations. A neutral position between the opposing forces is chosen at Panmunjom, a village only 10 kilometers east of the site of previous talks at Kaesong. A small detachment of military police is allowed to oversee the site. The People's Republic of China provides a tent, and the United States agrees to provide flooring, light, and heat. 4 hydrogen balloons are flown to mark the neutral zone. By the end of November, a de facto 1-month truce has begun. As the autumn of 1951 turns to winter, both sides take stock, replenish their forces and supply lines, and hope for a breakthrough across the negotiating table. The truce does not survive the winter, and the South's General Pak opens Operation Rat Killer in the peninsula's southwest to try to eliminate communist guerrillas operating there. Pak Sun-yop.
Communist guerrillas
had been a growing cancer in Korea since liberation from Japan at the end of World War II. Winter presented the optimum conditions for success. The absence of foliage and a layer of snow robbed the guerrillas of concealment.
Through a combination of ruthless military action and aid for the civilian population, the operation is largely successful by the end of January 1952. Little progress is made at the Panmunjom talks. The main stumbling block concerns the repatriation of prisoners of war. The North's position, supported by China, is that prisoners are to be returned to the army units they were in at the time of capture. The South and the UNC want the prisoners to decide on their destination. Amidst accusations of mistreatment and brutality on both sides, the issue will hamper the talks for months to come. The talks are also obstructed by the emergence of the controversial issue of germ warfare. The Minister of Foreign Affairs for North Korea, Lee Dong-hyun.
Violating all principles of human morality, the American interventionists are making widespread use of such barbarous and inhuman weapons of mass destruction as napalm and other chemical and biological weapons. From 28 January to 25 March 1952, bacterial weapons were used over 400 times. This included drops of infected insects. These acts have been confirmed by captured American airmen.
As the relevant information on covert military activity during the Korean War is still classified in US archives, the accusations remain unverified. February 1952, Sintan-ri, North Korea. Frontline troops are preparing for the anticipated spring offensives. Everyone fears another summer of bitter fighting, ridge to ridge, hill to hill. David Pak, a Korean translator with the UNC forces.
We have had enough of this war. Almost 2 years, and the situation is exactly as it was when the communists attacked. Except tens of thousands have died on both sides, and our country is in ruins. Is there any hope? It doesn't look good. The men at the negotiating table are stubborn politicians dressed as soldiers. They won't mind sacrificing men to win more concessions.
In March 1952, General Lemuel Shepard, commander of the US Marine Corps within the UNC, makes a tour of Seoul, the South Korean capital. Another long winter has produced major hardships for the civilian population in both North and South Korea. Both governments are conscious that the morale of non-combatants is as critical as the well-being of fighting men. The use of helicopters by United States forces within the United Nations Command is an innovation in a war zone. The rugged terrain of Korea is ideally suited to the helicopter's maneuverability. They are used for observation, evacuation, rescue, transport, and minesweeping. During the Korean conflict, UNC helicopters carry out over 10,000 medical evacuations from the battlefield. Their presence becomes emblematic of many conflicts to come. Late June 1952. A huge force of the North Chinese People's Volunteer Army is attempting to retake Hill 266, Old Baldy, to its UNC defenders. The UNC eventually gives way, but throughout the summer, Old Baldy changes hands several times. It is an exchange of territory typical of the meat grinder of a war that Korea has become. August, Hill 122, nicknamed Bunker Hill by UNC forces. It is becoming one of the most contested pieces of ground in the entire war. UNC headquarters estimates that it is facing over 1 million Chinese and North Korean men along the front line of the war, a line now known as the main line of resistance. The battle for the ridges and valleys of Korea's northern hinterland resumes with the same intensity as in previous years. Both sides need major logistical support, and UNC countries, particularly the United States, use their vast resources to improve the conditions for their troops on the ground. The battles are often a contrast between long-range artillery and airstrikes and hand-to-hand trench warfare. Casualties continue to escalate on both sides. However, one of the features of the Korean conflict, certainly from the perspective of UNC forces, is the enhanced level of medical care for wounded soldiers. The innovation of mobile army surgical hospitals, MASH units, close to the battlefield, and the rapid evacuation of injured men to offshore hospital ships saves many lives and sets a benchmark for all future theatres of war. Kim Moo-woo, a captain of the South's ROK Capital Division, attached to a battalion of US Marines at Outpost Siberia.
I was hit on Siberia. It was a very hot day, and all I could feel was the hot sun burning the wound on my leg. The medics got to me quickly and pumped me full of painkillers. I didn't remember much after that, except being strapped onto the copter. That was even more terrifying than the battlefield. I woke up out at sea in a US hospital ship, and before long, I was in a military hospital in Busan. They couldn't save my leg, but they saved my life.
September 17th, 1952. South Korea's President Syngman Rhee is presenting UNC Commander of the United States Marine Corps, General Lemuel Shepard, with a Korean Medal of Honor. Rhee has recently been re-elected as president for a second term and continues to rule the South with an iron fist. However, he is also able to turn his hand to gentler pursuits, and pen poetic reflections of the war. At the Chong'an Pavilion in Kansong, Syngman Rhee.
I'm standing on the eastern edge of the peninsula. All the hills in sight look like the divine peaks of legend. Wasn't it here that youth sent by Jin Shi Huang looked for the elixir of life? And when was it that Emperor Wu of Han China dreamed of this power? Aren't those the green hills of Yemek outside the gate? And isn't the crimson sun rising above the terrace the sun of pure? Amidst the war, no one claims this superb landscape. It is left to fishermen and white girls.
The beginning of autumn, 1952. There is still no real progress at the ceasefire talks, and the fighting on the battlefield continues unabated. Men on the ground on both sides are now fighting for territory to improve the bargaining power of their comrades at the negotiating table. In this instance, territory can be a matter of a few kilometers either way. It has become the kind of war hated by all soldiers, a war fought by politicians rather than fighting men. Pak Sun-yop, now the newly appointed Chief of Staff of the South's ROK, reflects on the ferocity of the fighting.
The enemy that had fought with such ferocity now vanished like fog under a burning sun. A solemn spectacle spread out before me. Countless enemy bodies were piled up at the bottom of every hill. The stench of rotting flesh assaulted the nostrils. NKPA artillery pieces, T-34s, were strewn all over the battlefield. I have no idea what the face of hell looks like, but it can't be more hideous than the battlefield before me.
October 26, 1952. As the Korean War moves towards another long winter, UNC forces face a major onslaught by Chinese troops and the NKPA. The fighting focuses on the Battle of the Hook, a 4-mile ridge to the northwest of the confluence of the Imjin and Samichon rivers. The Flower by Pak Yang-kyun, an officer in the South's ROK.
At whose request have you blossomed on this wasteland, where man slaughtered man? You nameless flower that confronts the sky with your fragile sweetness. How can you, a delicate plant standing upon your fragile stalk on a sunny road beneath blue heaven, efface with your ineffable smile the deafening din of cannons and bombs, and the screams and bloodbaths that shook the earth to its core?
Gojedo, an island off the south coast of Korea, 50 kilometers from Busan. It is the location of the UNC's largest prisoner of war camp, home to over 50,000 communist forces, POWs. Gojedo is difficult to control and has been the scene of several uprisings. One of the riots had led to the capture of the camp's commandant, Brigadier General Francis Dodd. His release was agreed after American forces signed a document admitting to the mistreatment of prisoners, a confession that was later withdrawn. The issue of prisoners of war will dominate the Korean conflict until the end of hostilities. November 8th, a medal ceremony presided over by ROK Colonel Kim Sung. Yun Chi, the wife of a soldier in the South's ROK.
We are so proud of our men, but also sad. The fighting goes on and more Koreans are dying. As for the foreigners, I don't understand. It is hard for us to accept the sacrifice of our sons and husbands. But how do their loved ones accept the loss of their men in a foreign land?
Christmas Day, 1952. Cardinal Francis Spellman, the United States senior prelate, is saying Mass. The service offers a moment of reflection for weary soldiers and the chance to pray that 1953 will see the bloody conflict on the Korean peninsula come to an end. Sadly, even as Mass is being celebrated, the fighting continues on the hillsides nearby. (1953) begins with UNC forces preparing for another long and arduous year of conflict. The United States' willingness to commit seemingly inexhaustible material to the UNC cause and in support of the South is beginning to place a huge strain on communist resources in Pyongyang and Beijing. The diary of a senior officer in the NKPA, Kim Chung.
American reinforcements arrive all the time. More importantly, their armor and ammunition is constantly being replaced. We are throwing more and more men at them, but our losses and those of our brave Chinese comrades are huge. They fight well, Americans, British, Turks, Australians. They are all experienced soldiers. We need the Russians and their Red Army.
Incheon, February 1953. The cause of Korean President Syngman Rhee in the South continues to be enhanced by foreign aid, particularly from the United States. While the North suffers increasing hardship, exacerbated by the effects of US-led UNC bombing raids, the economy in the South is supported by the war effort and the influx of aid. However, beneath the gloss of the colour film shot by UNC cameramen, life in the midst of war is still grim. Author Connie Kang remembers her childhood during the war in her book, The Land of Morning Calm.
Power and water cuts were routine occurrences. We used kerosene lamps and stood in line for hours with buckets to draw water from a public water pipe. People fought to get ahead in line. Sometimes we cooked food in water drawn from the sea. We did our laundry with sewer water from a ditch that came from a public bathhouse. And there was the nightly routine of delicing ourselves. picking at the lice buried in the folds of our clothes, like monkeys in a zoo, then wiping our fingernails clean with newspaper scraps.
Although life in the south is dismal, there are signs of hope. Spring in Wartime by Syngman Rhee.
The whole peninsula is wrapped in battle smoke, and Chinese flags and the sails of Western ships hide the spring sky. All who come and go are homeless vagabonds, and they are all fasting, like gods that shun food. Of the citadel, only the ancient walls remain, and farmers are burning forests to make farmland. The spring wind does not wait for the war to cease, and new grass is sprouting all around the ruined citadel.
Even in the darkest hours of the war, there are reminders of the indomitable spirit of the Korean people. In the most traumatic of circumstances, people endeavor to live normal lives. Children go to school, their parents hoping that their innocence will protect them from the horrors of war. Panmunjom, the ceasefire negotiations, 1953. The seemingly endless talking continues. However, the end of the deadlock on the Korean peninsula is about to be heralded by events in Moscow. On March 25, 1953, the news is released that Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, is dead. Stalin had convinced himself that a Third World War was inevitable and believed that any compromise in the Korean conflict would, in turn, weaken the position of the communist bloc. He also believed that it served the long-term interests of the Soviet Union that the United States and its allies exhaust their resources of men and equipment in defending South Korea against his Chinese and North Korean allies, rather than against men of his own Red Army. After Stalin's death, the new regime in Moscow, led by Malenkov, Molotov and Khrushchev, decides on a less confrontational stance towards the United States and its Western allies. There is relief in Beijing and Pyongyang. Their forces are exhausted and they are prepared to compromise. Suddenly, peace is a possibility. Chinese Foreign Minister Zhou Enlai announces on March 30th that he will accept a previously rejected proposal that prisoners of war who are unwilling to be repatriated can be released to a neutral state, where their final destination can be decided. Consequently, several thousand sick and wounded POWs are exchanged in Operation Little Switch in late April and early May. Munsan-ni, North Korea, 1953. Although some serious skirmishes continue and UNC bombing raids on the north persist, events begin to move quickly towards peace. On July 27, 1953, an armistice is signed and tens of thousands of POWs are released in Operation Big Switch. In November, the new United States Vice President, Richard Nixon, visits Korea. He and the new President, Dwight D. Eisenhower, will continue to wrestle with the perils of the Cold War throughout their time in office. Unbeknown to him, for Nixon, his Korean experience is the precursor of another Asian conflict in Vietnam that he will face during his own presidency 15 years later. The world had stood on the brink of atomic war, but has managed to survive. Sadly, there will be many more close calls in the years to come. Ironically, the status quo on the Korean peninsula that existed prior to the outbreak of war returns. I Ask You, by poet and schoolteacher Yu Chi-hwan.
The vast ocean swells and rolls to the east, and the Taebaek Range winds endlessly to the west. In the bright silence in between, at every bend and corner, trenches dug for man to spring at man lurk like reptiles. You mountains and ocean, tell me if you can. What's the point?
At the Panmunjom Armistice Line, Syngman Rhee and the people of the South stare across the divide at their Korean kith and kin, Kim Il-sung and the people of the North. Kim Il-sung will continue to rule North Korea for another 41 years, until his death in 1994, when he will be succeeded by his son, Kim Jong-il. In a speech to mark the 50th anniversary of the formation of the NKPA, the North Korean Army, in 1982, Kim Il-sung.
Our revolutionary armed forces have strengthened our solidarity. They have won a famous victory in the Fatherland Liberation War against the US imperialists. A toast to their health and the revolution.
Syngman Rhee will serve 4 terms as President of the South. However, in April 1960, popular protests will force him to flee the country, to live in exile until his death in 1965. In a private letter to John Chang, the Korean ambassador to the United States, Syngman Rhee.
Weakness and appeasement in the face of aggressive designs always lead to more and more aggression. Only those who dare to be strong deserve to be free. Our greatest hope must always lie in our own unaided determination to resist and to fight to the death for our liberties.
The strident views of the 2 protagonists reflect an ideological chasm, implacable and ominous, that will endure in Korea for decades to come. At Tori 1, by poet and academic Zhou Huan.
The war, which was so cruel, blew away like a rainstorm, leaving huts crumpled and houses with burnt thatched roofs. Today I passed this ruined and charred village, stepping casually. The only thing that heaven has spared is an old clay pot on a shelf, reminding me that I, like the clay pot, have been spared. The villagers who have returned look up from the ruins toward the distant hills. The sky is as blue as ever in the autumn sun of Dorion. A fragile cosmos shivers in the breeze.
The Swazi people are petrified of snakes. They used to destroy the snake, they'd shoot it. It's a black mamba in a house. We have to go and see if we can try and catch it. I do it because people need you. There's nobody else to do it. I'm out of control.
Tonight at 8 on WNED.
He defiantly showed the world an almost godlike facade.
But underneath that was this man who was desperately weak.
And when Hitler seemed poised to overrun all of Europe, U.S. intelligence had a groundbreaking idea.
What kind of guy is he? What are his ambitions?
To create a psychological profile of the Third Reich's leader.
It's like the holy grail for my field.
Go inside the mind of Adolf Hitler.
Thursday night at 9 on WNED.
Mark Russell's comedy specials helped us see the humor in American politics.
Gingrich goes to China to borrow money that Gore is returning.
People would ask me, are you a Democrat, are you a Republican? My answer is yes.
Jimmy Carter, give me liberty or make me an offer. Teddy Kennedy defeated a man named Mitt Romney, and the Mitt hit the fan in spite of the fact.
It's time to celebrate Mark Russell's America.
Friday night at 9 on WNED.
Martin Bamford is having a very bad day.
You've all slept with her.
So he leaves his wife and career for a vacation in a small Cornwall village.
Who is he?
What's he doing here?
And while the town grows on him...
I want to fish.
Martin, you're a doctor, not a fisherman.
He has a hard time growing on them.
You belong in the city, not here with us.
You ever shot anyone?
No.
You? Not yet.
Doc Martin, the movie.
Saturday night at 8 on WNED.
Do you dare move from an ordinary to an extraordinary life?
You can go way beyond just being average. There's not an average person watching this show. There's not an average person in this room tonight. All of us are extraordinary. We just have to come to believe it.
Join Dr. Wayne Dyer for Wishes Fulfilled, a joyful journey to manifesting your deepest desires while living from your highest self.
Tuesday night at 8 on WNED.
In the years before the War of 1812, the rivers and lakes were the vital transportation routes through Upper Canada. This is how the British shipped their troops and supplies to far-flung strategic outposts. As Anglo-American relations deteriorated, the British sought to control the Great Lakes. The focus was Lake Ontario at a place today called Toronto. It was easily defended, was home to a naval base, and a safer haven for the capital of Upper Canada, which John Graves Simcoe, the first governor, had named York.
And he was a very experienced military leader who had distinguished himself with the British Army in the American Revolutionary War. When he arrived after the Constitutional Act of 1791 to be this new lieutenant governor, the Queen's representative in the province of Upper Canada, they were drawing upon his military expertise.
Simcoe established the town deep in the harbour and protected its entrance with a fort. A gun battery was set up on the opposite peninsula.
The Garrison Creek entered Lake Ontario just to the east of the present fort. There was elevated ground on both the east and the west banks of the creek. John Graves Simcoe pitched his tent with his wife Elizabeth on the east side of the creek on elevated ground, but he constructed huts for the soldiers on the present site of Fort York here on the west side of the Garrison Creek.
When the log barracks disintegrated, a new fort was based on the east side of the creek, and in 1800, Government House was built on the west side. Simcoe's concerns had been well-founded. He'd been gone from the New World only a few years when tensions escalated, and war was declared in 1812. Much of the early fighting centered on Niagara, but the Battle of York loomed. The Americans had their sights fixed firmly on Fort York's British Naval Yard. On April the 27th, 1813, an American squadron of 14 warships and 1,700 men set out across Lake Ontario and attacked.
They met heavy resistance there from the British Army, which included native allies and the militia. They forced the British Army to retreat. They burnt the Russell Fort, the larger fort on the east side of the Garrison Creek, but they also burnt all the buildings on this side, the present site of Fort York, and that included the burning of the Lieutenant Governor's house.
As they retreated to Kingston, the British blew up the Grand Magazine, cutting down hundreds of American troops. The Americans occupied the town and torched the Parliament buildings. The church at York became a makeshift hospital, the rector, John Strahan, saving the British regimental colours by burying them under the church. He and the local militia were left to negotiate the terms of surrender.
Later on in the War of 1812, the British Army attacked Washington, D.C., burned the Houses of Congress in direct retaliation for the burning of our Parliament buildings, and then they burnt the White House in direct retaliation for the burning of the Lieutenant Governor's house here at Fort York.
Right after the Battle of York, its defenders moved to the west side of Garrison Creek and built the fort that survives today.
The inside of the walls today are all clad with stone. That wouldn't have been the case from its earliest days. They were earthworks shored up with logs and timber. If you jumped over the south wall in 1814 or 1815, you would have come very close to falling right into Toronto Harbour.
The remains of more than 16 original buildings have been found, and 7 of the 8 oldest buildings constructed in the city are here and intact.
We have blockhouse number 1 at the east end of the fort, blockhouse number 2 in the center of the fort, 2 brick barracks at the west end of the fort, the officers' mess establishment and barracks here, the junior officers' barracks, and we have 2 magazines, the stone magazine and the brick magazine.
The miracle of Fort York in one way is that it survived at all in any condition, and yet when we come into the oldest surviving buildings anywhere in the city, we actually see details of very rare architectural elements like paneling and window shutters.
The officers' mess, built in 1815 and later restored, includes some famous English china.
We found pieces of this outside the building so that we know it was used inside the building by the soldiers or the officers that lived here. And so the proper dishes were purchased to furnish this building as part of the restoration. The stonework.
They found ceilings and a cellar, along with a complex system of drains and a well. Archaeologists have also unearthed the foundations of the original governor's residence and some of his china destroyed during the Battle of York.
Inside the house when it was actually attacked and burned by the Americans, and it fell into the ground, and we've been able to recover pieces of it and glue it back.
There's an officer's cup dating back to Simcoe's log barracks of 1793, and heavy timbers of the wharves that once stretched south from Front Street into the harbour. And to prevent enemies from storming the walls, there are ditches, a moat, and palisades of sharpened wooden posts. Fort York National Historic Site also comprises the Fort York Armories, built in the 1930s, and Victoria Square Memorial Cemetery, where Simcoe's youngest daughter was buried in the 1790s.
The 43-acre site includes 2 cemeteries. It includes the walled portion of the fort, and it includes an area that we refer to as the common, or the garrison common. I think just in general that people don't realize how significant Fort York is, that this is the real deal. This is an authentic War of 1812 site. It's right under our noses in downtown Toronto. We just need to appreciate it for what it is, and we need to protect it, and we need to bring the site to life in meaningful ways for residents and visitors alike.
I'm roasting the pork, and I'm demonstrating how you can do it with on strings and with sticks, because that's one less cast iron pot you have to carry.
Exploring Fort York, you can appreciate the life and times of the soldiers. And every year on Remembrance Day, people gather to commemorate the Battle of York and pay their respects to the British, American and native soldiers who gave their lives in the War of 1812, a war that saw America and Canada come of age and establish their future.
Jim Stavrakakis had 2 childhood hobbies.
Photography and model airplanes. I'd hang them from one little thread and then take pictures of them with palm trees that make it look like the South Pacific.
His passion as a kid became his job in the Air Force.
My job was aerial photography. I'd go up on combat flights. And being over there in Korea really opened my eyes. America is not the only place. There's a lot of different religions, different habits, different thoughts. We're not all the same. I've always had a curiosity, and sticking my neck out to learn just a little bit more. And I think public TV, it answers your curiosity of life. It's always something different and new. And I think you've got to give back a little bit.
That's why Jim included his public television station in his will. Consider joining the community of people who want public television to span generations.
Mark Russell's comedy specials helped us see the humor in American politics.
Gingrich goes to China to borrow money that Gore is returning.
People would ask me, are you a Democrat, are you a Republican? My answer is yes.
Jimmy Carter, give me liberty or make me an offer. Teddy Kennedy defeated a man named Mitt Romney, and the Mitt hit the fan in spite of the fact.
It's time to celebrate Mark Russell's America.
Sunday afternoon at 3 on WNED.
We're all concerned about our health, and we should be. What would you say if I told you I had a secret? A simple, easy way for you to get healthy and to release untapped internal energy.
Tune in to see Brenda Watson live in the WNED studios as she takes us down the road to perfect health.
Saturday at 11 on WNED.
Give me the names of your assets.
You want me to use Harry's team to prove that he's a traitor?
I'm here to help you. Home Secretary, I would never betray this country. You know that.
The ace up our sleeve was Sugar Horse.
I can't give you the names. I'll never forgive you for the damage your actions have inflicted.
Thursday night at 10 on WNED.
Studying elephants is difficult.
Once they go into the bush, that's it.
But researchers at South Africa's Addo National Park have a remarkable idea. The Ellie Cam.
We've often been able to film them, but never really to see what she actually sees.
And if their camera can survive baths and tree branches, they'll uncover incredible new information about elephants. Discover what they learn from the Ellie Telly.
Tonight at 10 on WNED.